The sun filtered through the tall oak trees lining the streets as Renee Jackson stepped out of her father's stately townhouse. The city was still new to her, a sprawling, historic place that felt both inviting and overwhelming. Having spent most of her life in the chaos of New York City, Renee hoped this move would offer a fresh start. Her father, Jonathan Jackson, had been the city's mayor for 3 years, a role that kept him busy but also placed their family under public scrutiny. Renee had initially hesitated to leave the anonymity of her old life, but her father's insistence and the promise of quieter surroundings eventually persuaded her. She wrapped her gray scarf tighter against the crisp morning air and decided to explore the nearby Central Park. It was a popular spot, she'd heard, a place where families gathered, joggers found their rhythm, and people like her could enjoy a moment of peace. Renee's outfit was simple yet striking, a tailored gray coat, slim jeans, and white sneakers. Her blonde curls, often a topic of curiosity given her mixed-race heritage, framed her face. She had long since grown used to the double takes and murmurs, choosing to wear her hair as a badge of confidence rather than insecurity. As she entered the park, Renee felt herself relax. The scent of fresh-cut grass mingled with the sound of children's laughter. Kite strings soared high, cutting through the blue sky, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. For the first time since arriving in the city, she felt like she belonged here, but not everyone saw it that way. A short distance away, Officer Ethan Brooks leaned back in his patrol car, scanning the park with a watchful eye. A seasoned cop with 6 years on the force, Ethan prided himself on keeping order, though his definition of order often skewed toward profiling those he deemed out of place. Reports of petty crimes in the area had him on edge that morning. When his gaze landed on Renee, his instincts kicked in. Not the instincts of a seasoned law enforcement officer, but the snap judgments born from years of unchecked biases. "Who's she supposed to be?" Ethan muttered, narrowing his eyes. To him, Renee's confident stance and polished appearance didn't match his idea of someone casually strolling through the park. She stood out, and in Ethan's mind, that was enough to warrant suspicion. He adjusted his belt, stepped out of the car, and strode toward her. His boots crunched against the gravel, drawing Renee's attention. "Hey, you there!" Ethan called out, his tone sharp. Startled, Renee turned around. "Me? Yeah, you. What are you doing here?" Her eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "I'm taking a walk." "A walk, huh?" Ethan crossed his arms, his eyes sweeping her from head to toe. "Funny, you don't look like someone who just takes a walk around here." Renee stiffened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You know exactly what it means," Ethan said, his voice low and accusatory. "Let me see your ID." "I don't understand," Renee said, keeping her voice steady despite the unease rising in her chest. "Am I being accused of something?" "You're being questioned," Ethan snapped. "Now ID, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Reluctantly, Renee reached into her bag and handed him her identification. Ethan barely glanced at it before shoving it into his pocket. "You've got no right to treat me like this," Renee said, her frustration breaking through her calm. Ethan sneered. "I've got every right. You people always think you're above the rules." "You people?" Renee repeated, her voice edged with disbelief. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means you don't belong here, and I don't have to explain myself to you." Renee's hands clenched into fists. "This is harassment. I haven't done anything wrong." "You want to see harassment?" Ethan barked. "Put your hands behind your back." "What? No, this is ridiculous!" Renee protested, taking a step back. "Don't make me repeat myself," Ethan warned, his hand moving to the cuffs on his belt. Renee hesitated, her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew arguing further could escalate the situation. With a deep breath, she turned and placed her hands behind her back. Ethan snapped the cuffs onto her wrists with unnecessary force. "There. Now you can explain yourself back at the station." "This is a mistake," Renee said, her voice steady but firm. "You're going to regret this." Ethan smirked as he led her toward his patrol car. "We'll see who regrets what." As Renee sat in the back seat, the reality of her situation sank in. The anger bubbling inside her wasn't just for herself. It was for every person who had been treated like this before her. She stared out the window, her jaw set in determination. If Ethan Brooks thought this was the end of the story, he was gravely mistaken. The patrol car rumbled to a halt outside the brick facade of the police station. Renee Jackson sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed, her gaze fixed on the dreary building in front of her. Her thoughts raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. She wasn't just thinking about herself anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of prejudice masquerading as authority. Officer Ethan Brooks swung open her door and yanked her out with unnecessary force. "Come on," he barked, pulling her toward the entrance. Renee resisted the urge to snap back. She knew better than to escalate things further, but every fiber of her being burned with anger and disbelief. As they entered the station, the echo of their footsteps drew the attention of other officers. Conversations fell silent, heads turned, and eyes widened as they saw Ethan dragging in a young woman in handcuffs, her polished appearance starkly contrasting with the image he projected. "Brooks, what's going on?" an older officer asked, stepping forward. "Caught her hanging around the park, looking suspicious," Ethan replied with a smirk. The older officer raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? How so?" "She looked like she didn't belong," Ethan said, his tone dripping with self-assurance. Before the conversation could continue, a voice cut through the murmurs. "Brooks, in my office. Now." All eyes turned to see Captain Mitchell Reeves standing at the end of the hallway, his sharp gaze fixed on Ethan. A tall man in his 50s with a reputation for being fair but firm, Captain Reeves exuded authority. Ethan's smirk faltered. "Yes, sir," he muttered, hesitating for a moment before turning to another officer. "Take her to holding." "Not so fast," Reeves interrupted, his voice cold. He walked toward them, his eyes scanning Renee before settling back on Ethan. "What's her name?" "Didn't ask," Ethan replied casually. Reeves frowned, his jaw tightening. He turned to Renee. "Miss, what's your name?" "Renee Jackson," she said, her voice steady. "I live in this city. My father is Mayor Jonathan Jackson." A hush fell over the room. Ethan froze, his eyes widening as the weight of her words sank in. Reeves's frown deepened. "Brooks, you brought in the mayor's daughter?" I didn't know," Ethan stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating. "Didn't know because you didn't bother to ask," Reeves snapped. "Take off her cuffs. Now." Ethan hesitated, but a single glare from Reeves sent him fumbling for his keys. His hands shook as he unlocked the cuffs, and Renee rubbed her wrists, her expression unreadable. "I apologize, Miss Jackson," Reeves said, his tone sincere. "This is not how we operate, or at least it's not how we should." Renee met his eyes. "An apology isn't enough, Captain. Your officer insulted me, threatened me, and dragged me here without cause. What are you going to do about it?" Reeves nodded, his face grim. "Follow me." He turned to Ethan. "In my office, now." Inside the captain's office, the tension was palpable. Renee sat in a chair, her posture calm but her gaze unwavering. Ethan stood by the door, shifting uncomfortably under Reeves's piercing glare. "Explain yourself," Reeves demanded, his tone icy. Ethan swallowed hard. "Sir, I saw her in the park. She looked out of place. I thought—" "You thought what?" Reeves interrupted. "That she was committing a crime? That she was a threat? Or did you just think she didn't look like she belonged in your park?" Ethan stammered, his face reddening. "I was doing my job." "Your job," Reeves said slowly, his voice dripping with contempt. "Your job is to serve and protect, not harass citizens based on your personal biases. Do you even realize the damage you've done?" "She didn't say she was the mayor's daughter," Ethan muttered defensively. Reeves's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't matter. Even if she weren't, you had no right to treat her or anyone this way. You threatened her, humiliated her, and dragged her here without cause. That's abuse of power, Brooks. Plain and simple." Renee leaned forward. "If I weren't the mayor's daughter, I have no doubt this would have been worse. And I'm not the only person this has happened to. How many others have been treated like this by your officers?" Reeves sighed heavily, the weight of her words clear on his face. "You're right," he said quietly. "This is a systemic issue, and it's unacceptable." He turned back to Ethan. "As of this moment, you're suspended pending a full investigation. Hand over your badge and gun." Ethan's jaw dropped. "Captain, you can't." "I can," Reeves cut him off. "And I just did." Get out of my office." Ethan hesitated, his face a mix of anger and humiliation, but he eventually complied. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Renee and Reeves alone. Reeves looked at her, his expression apologetic. "Miss Jackson, I'm deeply sorry for what happened. I'll ensure this is handled properly." Renee stood, her voice firm. "I'll hold you to that, Captain. This isn't just about me, it's about your entire department. If you don't address this, I will." Reeves nodded solemnly. "Understood." As Renee walked out of the station, she felt a fire burning within her. This was just the beginning. The hearing room at the city's disciplinary board was filled to capacity. Reporters, city officials, and community members packed the rows of seats, their murmurs creating a hum of tension in the air. At the front of the room, a panel of 5 stern-faced board members sat behind a long table, reviewing the evidence before them. Ethan Brooks sat at a small table near the front, looking nothing like the confident officer he had been a few days ago. His uniform was replaced by a suit, his face pale and drawn. To his left, a public defender whispered hurried advice, though it was clear even they knew the case was a losing battle. Renee Jackson entered the room with her father, Mayor Jonathan Jackson, by her side. Her tailored black dress and steady gaze exuded quiet strength. As the two made their way to their seats near the front, the murmurs grew louder. Everyone knew this case was more than just about one officer and one woman. It was about systemic issues that had gone unchecked for too long. The hearing began with the presentation of evidence. Footage from Ethan's body camera played on a large screen, showing the encounter in the park. The room watched in stunned silence as Ethan's aggressive tone and derogatory remarks echoed through the speakers. "Do you think your blonde hair makes you better than the rest of them?" His voice sneered on the recording. The next clip showed him handcuffing Renee, ignoring her calm but firm protests. The tension in the room was palpable as the footage ended, and the chairperson of the disciplinary board turned to Ethan. "Officer Brooks," the chairperson said, her voice sharp, "you've been accused of multiple violations, including racial profiling, unlawful detainment, and abuse of power. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I thought she was suspicious. I didn't mean for it to get out of hand." The chairperson's eyes narrowed. "Suspicious? Based on what?" Ethan fumbled for an answer, but his silence spoke volumes. When it was Renee's turn to testify, she rose with quiet confidence, her every step deliberate as she approached the witness stand. The room hushed as she began to speak. "My name is Renee Jackson," she said, her voice calm but resonant. "I am not here today just as the daughter of Mayor Jonathan Jackson. I am here as a citizen who was treated unjustly by someone who swore to serve and protect." She glanced at the board members, her gaze steady. "On the morning in question, I was simply walking through the park, enjoying the fresh air, when I was stopped, insulted, and humiliated for no reason other than the way I look. Officer Brooks assumed that because I'm a black woman with blonde hair, I didn't belong there. He didn't ask questions or try to understand. He acted on his biases, and that's not just dangerous, it's unacceptable." Renee paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "But this isn't just about me. How many others have been treated like this? How many people didn't have the privilege of their story being heard because they aren't the mayor's child? This kind of behavior erodes trust between the police and the community they're supposed to protect. It's not just a problem with one officer, it's a problem with the system." Her voice grew stronger as she concluded. "I demand accountability, not just for myself, but for every person who has ever been targeted because of their race, their class, or their appearance. We can't move forward until we acknowledge and address the rot at the core of this institution." When she finished, the room was silent for a moment before a smattering of applause broke out, quickly hushed by the chairperson's gavel. The disciplinary board deliberated for over an hour before returning with their decision. The chairperson stood, her expression grave. "After reviewing the evidence and testimony, this board finds Officer Ethan Brooks guilty of all charges. Effective immediately, Officer Brooks is terminated from the police force and will face criminal charges for abuse of power and unlawful detainment." A collective murmur spread through the room, some nodding in approval, others whispering about the broader implications of the decision. Ethan slumped in his seat, his face ashen. For the first time, he seemed to fully grasp the consequences of his actions. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Renee and her father, microphones and cameras thrust forward as questions were shouted over one another. "Miss Jackson, how do you feel about the board's decision? Do you think this will lead to real change? What's your next step?" Renee raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "Today was a victory, but it's only the beginning. Holding one officer accountable is important, but it won't fix the system. We need reform, oversight, and a commitment to justice from everyone in law enforcement. My father and I are committed to making sure that happens." Mayor Jackson stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "We will be launching a comprehensive review of the police department's practices and implementing reforms to ensure transparency and fairness. No one should have to endure what my daughter experienced, or worse." As they walked away, Renee felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Justice had been served, but she knew the fight wasn't over. Change wasn't a moment, it was a movement, and she was ready to see it through. The days following the disciplinary hearing were a whirlwind of activity. Renee Jackson's story had become a national headline, sparking heated debates about policing practices, racial profiling, and systemic reform. News stations aired the footage from the hearing, social media platforms were ablaze with discussions, and protesters gathered outside City Hall demanding meaningful change. In his role as mayor, Jonathan Jackson faced mounting pressure to act swiftly. But for him, this wasn't just about politics, it was personal. Watching his daughter stand strong against injustice had ignited a deeper resolve within him. A week later, Mayor Jackson held a press conference at City Hall. The room was packed with journalists, community leaders, and members of the police department. Renee stood near the front, her arms crossed, her presence a silent but powerful reminder of why they were all there. Jonathan approached the podium, his face serious yet determined. He adjusted the microphone and began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, as many of you know, my daughter Renee Jackson experienced an unacceptable abuse of power at the hands of someone who was supposed to protect her. While I am grateful that justice was served in this individual case, I stand here today to acknowledge that this is not just about one officer or one incident. What happened to Renee is part of a larger problem, a problem that affects countless people who don't have the platform or privilege to speak out. It is a failure of the system, and as mayor, I take responsibility for ensuring that this system changes." He paused, his voice steady as he continued. "Today, I am announcing a comprehensive police reform plan for our city. This plan will include mandatory bias training for all officers, the establishment of an independent oversight committee to review complaints, and the implementation of body camera policies that ensure transparency and accountability. Our goal is not to vilify the police, but to build a department that serves and protects every member of our community with fairness, respect, and integrity. This is about rebuilding trust and ensuring that no one, regardless of their race, gender, or background, feels unsafe in the presence of law enforcement." The room erupted into applause, though a few skeptical murmurs lingered at the edges. Jonathan turned to Renee, his expression softening. "I want to thank my daughter Renee for her courage and determination. She reminded me, and all of us, of the power of speaking out. Change begins with voices like hers." The reforms didn't come without resistance. Some officers within the department pushed back, claiming the new measures were unnecessary or overly harsh. However, Captain Mitchell Reeves, the police captain who had intervened on Renee's behalf, stood firmly in support of the changes. "I've served this department for over 2 decades, he told reporters during a separate press conference, "and I'll be the first to admit that we have a lot of work to do. But I believe in this city, and I believe we can be better. These reforms aren't just necessary, they're overdue." Renee herself became a prominent voice in the movement. She appeared on news programs, participated in community forums, and partnered with local activists to advocate for broader justice initiatives. Her poise and clarity made her a respected figure in the conversation, and she used her platform to amplify stories of others who had been silenced. One bright Saturday morning, Renee and her father returned to Central Park, the place where everything had started. The air was crisp, the sunlight filtering through the trees in golden streaks. Families picnicked on the grass, joggers passed by, and children laughed as they chased kites through the open field. Renee paused by the fountain where her encounter with Ethan Brooks had begun. She took a deep breath, letting the memories wash over her. This place, once tainted by fear and anger, now felt different. Jonathan joined her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "You've made me proud, Renee," he said softly. "Not just because you stood up for yourself, but because you stood up for everyone else too." She smiled, her gaze fixed on the water rippling in the fountain. "I couldn't have done it without you, but we're not finished yet." "No," Jonathan agreed, his tone resolute. "We're not, but we've started something important." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the world move around them. The park felt peaceful again, not because the fight was over, but because they had proven that change was possible. As they walked away, the sunlight warming their backs, Renee felt a quiet sense of hope. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready, because justice wasn't just a destination, it was a journey. In the months that followed, the city began implementing the reforms Mayor Jackson had promised. Officers underwent extensive bias training. The Oversight Committee began addressing long-ignored complaints, and trust between the police and the community began to rebuild. Renee continued her advocacy work, speaking at universities, community centers, and rallies. Her story inspired others to step forward, and her message was clear. Everyone deserves to feel safe, respected, and valued. The changes didn't happen overnight, and the work was far from complete. But as Renee often said, change isn't easy, but it's worth it. One step at a time, we'll get there. And with that hope, the city moved forward, determined to create a future where justice truly was for all.